the shepherding movement is one of the main branches of the latter rain movement. And I explained to you in the last episode how one of the elders of Sharon Orphanage went and co-pastored a church with Derek Prince with support of Ern Baxter during the 1960s. And that is where the kernels, really, of shepherding movement were born. And the guys who all formed the shepherding movement had all come together and were working together by the mid 1960s, right? You'll find a lot of sources that tell you that didn't start happening until the 70s, but that's not true. They were together, and all this was started by the mid 60s, and somewhat earlier than that. The kernels of it go back to the mid 50s, but the group of them had started by the mid 60s, and Derek Prince was by far the most senior guy in it, the most prominent for popularizing the ideas and spreading it. But I said that today I was going to talk about a man named Bob Mumford a bit, and that's who I'm going to first talk about. Bob Mumford before we get to the Jesus people. So Bob Mumford, who is Bob Mumford? So you've heard us talk before in the podcast about the Elim Missionary Fellowship, right? And when we've talked about that before, we've mentioned how when the latter rain kicked off, it actually completely took over two denominations. One of the denominations that the latter rain took over was the Independent Assemblies of God, which really was the main trunk of the movement. The other denomination which they took over was the Elim Missionary Fellowship, which was not a super big group, but they were a large size group. They had churches both in Europe and North America. The Elim Missionary Fellowship, and the connections there back to Branhamism and everything are very important to note. William Branham, one of his very first campaign managers was W.E. Kidson, right? He was originally the General Secretary of Pentecostal Assemblies that merged to form the UPC. Well, W.E. Kidson, after he worked with Branham, went and joined Elim as the pastor of one of their most important churches. And his son-in-law was a man named Henry Gordon McGee. And these two men were very important ministers in the Elim Fellowship. Okay, and so there was from the latter rain not only a latter rain influence, but a very important Branhamism influence into the Elim Missionary Fellowship. And as far as I know, I mean, Elim still reveres William Branham, to the present day. Well, Bob Mumford comes from there. That is where Bob Mumford comes from. He comes from one of the two denominations that have been completely taken over by latter rain, which key people close to William Branham were in leadership roles in it, and were really deeply influenced by all of that stuff. That's where Bob Mumford comes from. And Bob Mumford, coming from that background, joins the shepherding movement and becomes one of the top 5 leaders in the shepherding movement. Okay? And he is living in California, in Los Angeles, during the Summer of Love when the Jesus People movement starts. Okay? And so I'm just going to set that to a side, and then we're going to start talking about the Jesus movement, and Bob Mumford is going to come back into it. But Bob Mumford is deep in latter rain. He has well-documented connections back to Branhamism, and he is connected to, he's one of the 5 who had really worked directly with leaders out of Sharon Orphanage at one point in his past. So there he is in Los Angeles when the Jesus People movement starts. So what is the Jesus People movement? We just assume that nobody knows, John. So the Jesus People movement is basically in 1967, that was the Summer of Love, or 2 years after William Branham has died. And I don't know how many, 1 million kids run away from home all over America. They hitchhike to Los Angeles, and they live a carefree life of drugs, sex, and rock and roll on the streets all summer long. I mean, that's the Summer of Love, John. And, they're high on LSD and everything else, They are practicing nudism, I mean, it is from the message perspective, it's very hard to wrap your mind around what that was, but that's what it was. And as that's happening, you have the Jesus movement starts there. There are people doing Christian outreach to that group to try and, I don't know, I'm sure they might have had some good motives, right? These are kids who've run away from home. A lot of them are hungry. They have nowhere to live. And a lot of the way that the early Jesus people attracted all of their people was they were offering free meals and places to stay to all these homeless, hungry hippies. Okay, and the hungry, homeless hippies wanted some food and a roof, and so they would come and endure a sermon in order to get some free food. I mean, this is how it started. I mean, I know a lot of people, I think they kind of, from my perspective, they spiritualize it and all this stuff. I don't really see that. I see a bunch of hungry people, John, looking for a free meal. And then God maybe used the free meal to save their souls at the end of the day. But here they come, for free meals. And they attract a lot of people. And there are a number of people there in the Los Angeles area who are getting in on that action. And of course, we know Chuck Smith, Calvary Chapel, all that in that point in time. But I really especially want to focus on Lonnie Frisbee. So Lonnie Frisbee, if you look at most histories, Lonnie Frisbee, they will call him the face of the Jesus movement, and they'll call him the catalyzing figure of the Jesus movement. He is perhaps the most critical person to the whole thing. Now, that's not to say that other people weren't important. Like other people, I think, truly were equally important. But Lonnie Frisbee was critical to this thing at the beginning, right? And as this kicks off, Lonnie Frisbee gets invited in to work with Chuck Smith at Calvary Chapel at the very beginning, essentially, and becomes a notable face in the Jesus movement very early on. Well, Lonnie Frisbee was in the shepherding movement, John. Lonnie Frisbee was a disciple of Bob Mumford. Lonnie Frisbee, so from the very beginning, the key figures in the Jesus People movement were out of the shepherding movement. And I would go so far as to say Lonnie Frisbee was a lifelong shepherding disciple, even. He, at a certain point, he packed up and he moved to Fort Lauderdale, and he sat under the direct mentorship of Derek Prince for, I think, 3 or 4 years even, right, through all of this. And so what you have, John, in the early days as the Jesus People kicks off, I feel like to some extent the shepherding movement targeted even Lonnie Frisbee for recruitment in those days. They came after him. And if you read through, like, even Lonnie Frisbee's testimonies and stuff, I think it's fair to say that they targeted Lonnie Frisbee for recruitment. Because Bob Mumford and several of the others of the top leaders of the shepherding movement, they had been approaching Chuck Smith. And they had been trying to get invitations to speak at the Jesus People conventions. And Chuck Smith rebuffed them, wouldn't let them speak. And we can debate Chuck Smith's motives, right, around all of that. But whatever the case, Chuck Smith would not let the shepherding leaders come speak at his Jesus People events. And so they started using Lonnie Frisbee as a backdoor, John. That's absolutely what they did. They used Lonnie Frisbee as a backdoor to get access to the Jesus People. And so they would use Lonnie Frisbee on the sidelines to have Jesus People events outside of Calvary Chapel, in which Lonnie Frisbee would attract the people, and he would share the stage with the headlining top shepherding movement guys. And so from the very beginning, you have a faction of the Jesus People who are being deeply influenced by the shepherding movement, John. And to be honest, a whole lot of that has to do with the whole breakdown in the relationship between Chuck Smith and Lonnie Frisbee. Essentially, the breakdown of relationship was the early leaders there around Chuck Smith rejected the shepherding movement influence and they were unhappy with Lonnie Frisbee. It wasn't simply that Lonnie Frisbee was just into, miracles and stuff. Lonnie Frisbee was in the shepherding movement, and he was bringing in the top leading guys of the shepherding movement, and they actually had some, pretty strong disagreements over that stuff, and that is why a big part of why they initially parted company. Now, there's a whole lot more a person can say about that, John. There's a whole lot more a person could say about Chuck Smith there, but essentially, somewhere along the way, Calvary Chapel did start to kind of reject that shepherding movement influence, but that influence remained in the Jesus movement, and it moved on to another stage, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes later. And that stage that was rejected by Calvary Chapel, and they went on their path. The piece that was rejected, that is what then leads on the critical path to the new Apostolic Reformation.